Välkommen till den lättsamma podden Let Me Know om den amerikanska rockgruppen Kiss med Marco och Bernt. Nu kör vi!
When it's really, really hot out, you can't get away from it. There's no denying it. So this show is hot in the shade. No matter where you see it from, no matter where you are, it's hot.
So you're keen on music? Yes!
My name is Julian, and I'm addicted to Kisstory. Jag vill tacka Bernt och Marco för möjligheten att vara värd för sommarspecialversionen av Let Me Know-podden. Likaså vill jag tacka den svenska och skandinaviska Kiss Army för deras stöd till mina många projekt under årtiondena. Jag önskar att jag kunde göra det här avsnittet på svenska och samtidigt njuta av diverse poddar och Carl och Alex fantastiska böcker, men det kan jag inte, så det får bli på engelska. When Bernt invited me to participate in the summer special, I immediately knew that the answer was yes. What time and which aircraft carrier? The answer took no thought, nor did the topic. I don't have to look far to see a binder full of notes for my currently on hold project, War Machine, 1982 to 84. Which as Mass Hysteria did for 1980, I hope will accomplish the same for Vinnie Vincent's tenure with the group. My interest in this time period is a result of several factors. Firstly, Odyssey, the book that ends as this story begins. It inspired Mass Hysteria, which filled in what came before and went some way to possibly explaining why things happened the way that they did in 1981. War Machine would be about how Kiss recovered from that 1981 Odyssey. Secondly, the Creatures of the Night box set, released in 2022, provides a massive motivation. It is a monument to both Gene and Paul's reaction to the adversity they faced in 1981, continuing into early 1982. An official commercial box can seldom contain everything that one would hope it might. Accompanying components are often compromised by economic and other considerations. As a result, I hope to fill in what I consider to be some of those gaps. But most importantly, it was the death of producer Michael James Jackson that inspires this episode, and War Machine, should it ever reach a point where I feel it can be shared. Following his death, some of his personal effects were sold in a storage unit auction. I was fortunate to be able to obtain some items of interest, including an amazing 2-inch reel that has since been returned to Universal Music, where it rightfully belongs. While the destiny of the contents of that item is beyond my control, I was also able to obtain Michael's producer contracts with the Kiss Company for both the 1982 and 1983 albums, and his day planners, 1974 through 1987, excluding 1983. In absence of the abundance of Allcoin-era memoranda, both circulating and privately held, covering Kiss's 1973 to 81 era, this material provides additional insight into the period in which Michael worked with Kiss. Had this material been available prior to the Creatures box being completed, it would have been offered for use to the project's creative team. That's enough of a long-winded preamble, so let's get to my version of the story. Die-hard fans will probably know most of it, but perhaps they'll encounter a few new glittering gems of information. Managing to record and release a studio album in 1981 proved to be a Pyrrhic victory for Kiss. The result of that battle, Music from the Elder, was a commercial failure that did serious damage to the band's brand and image. Musically, it further alienated their rapidly dwindling fan base, drove another wedge in the relationship between band and label, and served as the final straw for guitarist Ace Frehley. Ace, who had been strongly against the concept album, had been proven right. However, there would be no satisfaction from that. Ace had more than enough of his own personal issues to deal with. He'd blown $600,000 on his state-of-the-art home studio, but having been built underground, it suffered from water leakage. That's over $2 million in 2024 money. He had started trying to sell the property in late 1981, though he wouldn't be able to get rid of it until August 1986. While he was tired of the makeup, there was little doubt that with the internal issues and change of the group dynamic following Peter's departure, Ace was simply not up to the task at hand of contributing meaningfully to Kiss digging themselves out of a pit of despair. While spiraling out of control, he still had the reality of a baby daughter to cope with. From crashing a car through the front of his house in May 1981, on the eve of recording with Bob Ezrin in Canada, he became more unreliable once it became clear that Music from the Elder was doomed. Even with the benefit of national television exposure in the US, Ace walked away from the end of the album's promotional cycle. The album may simply have been a lost cause by that point anyway. He simply didn't show up for the group's satellite broadcast appearance from Studio 54 for the Italian San Remo Festival on January the 28th, 1982. What is interesting is even by that time, the band and management had been taking steps to move on from the album and rapidly address Phonogram's demands for more Kiss-like material. By this time, it had become a contractual obligation, and from the group's business perspective, large sums of money were contingent on maintaining the 1980 agreement. It was in Kiss's interest to placate a label that had invested so much in them as a top-tier signing. Unfortunately, by early 1982, they'd violated several clauses in that contract, but responded accordingly. Fittingly, Ace's final act of work with Kiss took place for the Friday's live television performance. It involved musical rehearsals January the 9th through 12th at SIR Studios in New York City, followed by a live broadcast on the evening of January the 15th. In parallel with the band traveling to California for the show, Howard Marks met with producer Michael James Jackson in Beverly Hills on the afternoon of January the 14th. Michael had already built a positive reputation outside the genre Kiss generally operated in as a song-oriented producer. It was happenstance that his name had been thrown into the mix. Gene's then-girlfriend, Diana Ross, had signed with Glickman Marks in December 1979, and her lawyer also represented Michael. It was a fortunate confluence that brought him into the picture. He was working with Jesse Colin Young, of whom Gene was a fan, while also trying to develop a young James House at the time. From neither the school of Eddie Kramer nor Bob Ezrin, Michael on the surface would appear more aligned with the sonic fingerprints of Vinnie Poncia or Ron Nevison, who had been the first choice to produce Paul's solo album in 1978. From that context, the intent doesn't seem to initially have been the massive sonic paradigm shift that it became. It seems that more a reversion to the Dynasty period was sought, one that married commercial acceptability with Kiss's core rock ethos. Who was Michael James Jackson? Michael had worked his way up from the ground floor of the recording industry, though his mother, Fran Jackson Harrison, had managed artists including Peggy Lee and Nat King Cole. Perhaps it was there that the important skill of dealing with talent and their business was first observed, a decade prior to being anywhere near the control room side of a studio. First a copy editor, he was soon writing liner notes and even using his interest in poetry to write radio jingles. Once latched onto the periphery of the business, he started absorbing knowledge from everyone he encountered. A natural inquisitiveness led to a growing knowledge about miking techniques, technical processes, and recording methods. Even with an inherent shyness and reserve, he was a people's person and had a natural empathetic, patient, and understanding nature. It was at Elektra Records where he encountered a passed-out Jim Morrison lying in the bushes, thinking Jim a deceased homeless person. By 1974, he was working in artist relations for A&M Records and pushed for Jerry Moss to sign San Francisco soft rock group Pablo Cruz. He'd produced their debut album the following year. Throughout the 1970s, he'd worked with the likes of Steve Harley, Lauren Wood, the hardest he got was working with Red Ryder. At the time he was engaged by Kiss, he had already worked with engineers such as Dave Whitman, Nico Bolas, and Peggy McCreary. He continued to work on Jesse Colin Young's The Perfect Strangers album for Elektra, and headed development sessions with James House throughout the period he worked with Kiss. For those projects, he had engaged an assortment of session players, including Mike Porcaro, Jimmy Haslip, Robin Ford, and Rick Derringer. They're all names that reoccurred during his period working with Kiss. For the remaining Kiss fans in early 1982, he was an unknown quantity, a producer seemingly more comfortable working with AOR artists than the brashest of New York rock groups. However, back then, they hardly had the information sources that we benefit from these days. For Michael, the genre of the artist wasn't a particularly important factor. Each had similarities in the challenges faced while completing a project successfully. That said, after the experience with their previous producer, Gene Simmons wasn't so sure that the band needed a producer at all. Part of it was a matter of pure economics and the inevitable cost of bringing in an A-list producer to work with them. Talent like Eddie Kramer came with a high price tag. Super Kiss thinking persisted, and producers get paid up front and from the performance-related royalties of the work that they do. Part of it may also have been a fear of becoming stranded in the studio and receiving no, or worse, bad advice from someone ill-equipped to advise Kiss. However, within the industry, A-list producers weren't exactly kicking down the band's door in early 1982. Following the Friday's broadcast, Bill Aucoin met with Michael for lunch on Saturday, January the 16th. He immediately felt that he could bring a valuable new perspective to the band. Through that series of meetings, the initial contacts, and then with Paul and Gene individually during their California visit, Michael was presented with the scope of the challenge at hand. He faced the complicated task of redefining the band for the fans and extricating Kiss from the commercial abyss into which they'd leaped. In early 1982, while Kiss was no longer a top echelon band, their name and image continued to resonate in the public and industry consciousness. While an A-lister may not have been interested in attaching their name to a Kiss project in 1982, a non-lister might see more of an opportunity. Like any gamble, there was also a potential payoff. It was an opportunity for Michael to break into a new area of the business and raise his profile through working with a group with undeniable stature, and it was a paycheck. A $35,000 entry was noted in his day planner on January the 19th, suggesting that that sum, which was later formalized for his services in an employment contract, had been discussed at that stage. The mission was one which Michael found appealing, and there was an immediate rapport with the band members. He, Bill, and Gene and Paul were cognizant of the importance of the album for the future, or even survival of the band, and Michael was very much aware of the role he was being entrusted with. It was a critical juncture, and all parties knew how much was really at stake. Michael's calm demeanor was a perfect lubricant for the inevitable friction the project faced. Paul Stanley later recalled that he found Michael introspective and intellectual, helping the pair to hit it off. Where Paul was unsure what Michael had to offer musically, he was sure that Kiss needed someone. He also recognized that he and Gene could all too easily be counterproductive together, due to being unable to compromise their respective musical ideas. Michael was an acceptable intermediary, not sullied by pre-existing connections to them or the organization. Michael agreed, recalling in 2018,
in any creative process between more than one person and himself, sometimes even then two, it's always a tug of war. People have different reactions, feelings, points of view. Gene and Paul had a lot of history together, and there were certainly things that they didn't agree about. So one of the roles that I think I played was to be able to mediate some of that. and act as the person in the middle, which took some of the pressure off for each one of them, I think.
Activities were becoming serious, and Michael flew to New York to meet with Bill at AMI's offices on January the 22nd. Additional conversations followed with Bill on January the 25th and 27th. By that time, Music from the Elder was a twitching commercial corpse, having commenced its Titanic-like descent into oblivion on the charts. Since Paul and Gene were no longer directly writing together, and noting the challenges afflicting creativity the previous year, Michael recognized the importance of bringing in external writers and sourcing material for the band's consideration. Perhaps at the behest of a coin, he contacted Russ Ballard in early February. Russ's Some Kind of Hurricane had already been placed with Peter Criss for the new solo album he was recording, suggesting the recommendation probably came from AMI or Glickman Marks, possibly with Ace Frehley in mind. But Ace was essentially done with Kiss and sailed off into the sunset, leaving his bandmates to sink or swim, perhaps recognizing that he had to save himself or be consumed by self-destruction. At the time of the San Remo satellite broadcast, Paul used the standard excuse that Ace was sick, and the show went on with Kiss appearing as a trio. With Ace unwilling or unable to participate in Kiss's attempt to salvage their career, Gene and Paul had another obstacle to navigate. Rather than being a knockout punch to their aspirations for recovery, it tempered their steely resolve. On February the 15th, 1982, Michael signed a production agreement with Kiss via Glickman Marks Management Corporation, with a pre-production period commencing immediately. Howard Marks signed on behalf of the group. The agreement specified that Michael was engaged to
produce in accordance with company's reasonable requirements one LP embodying the performance of the artist collectively professionally known as Kiss, consisting of Gene Simmons, Paul Stanley and Ace Frehley.
Eric Carr wasn't mentioned because he was employed directly by the group as a hired player. While his position had become tenuous with the group, Ace was still part of the business, and Gene and Paul would keep open options for his potential return for the remainder of the year. But some of that may have been part of a ruse to keep up appearances to Phonogram and deal with one contractual issue at a time, so that Ace's departure could be better strategized by the business, hopefully on the back of a successful album. Mirroring the Phonogram contract, the agreement specified that the completed album would include between 9 and 12 songs. That very day, Michael called Adam Mitchell. Michael had known Adam since his days with A&M Records, when Adam was working with the Canadian band Flood. While Paul was initially circumspect about working with a new collaborator, the pair soon established a rapport. Paul's responsiveness to what Adam was bringing to the table was obvious, with Partners in Crime and I'm a Legend Tonight quickly being generated. At the end of February, the group committed to their tenuous legal plan and sued Phonogram International in New York's U.S. District Court for an alleged failure to pay nearly $2 million in royalties, and for Schlocking, seeking compensatory damages of $5 million and an award of punitive and exemplary damages of at least $10 million. Earlier in the month, plans for a 1982 tour had been discussed internally at AMI for a prospective 70 dates starting July the 1st. while the scope and costs were scaled back drastically from an earlier budget, but tellingly, a $2,000 per week line item was included for a lead guitarist. Clearly, touring for Music from the Elder had been abandoned when compared with the previous year's tour's budget. Production rehearsals were budgeted for a single week, enough for a non-complex music-focused rock show. Perhaps more notable than the guitarist line item was the lack of a commission for AMI. Also removed were the multiple keyboard players and synthesizers, further highlighting the change of form. This suggests that in the very least, a hit-and-run tour may have been considered, at least to generate cash flow. Around this time, designer Mark Ravitz was engaged to conceptualize staging for a possible United States tour. As a result, the Dreadnought Battle Wagon design, later the basis for the stage design on the Creatures tour, was born. Simultaneously, Kiss may have started taking steps to find a fill-in for Ace. Ads started appearing in the Village Voice on March the 6th.
Aucoin management looking for a strong performing, heavy metal, male, lead guitarist. Must be a strong singer and songwriter for a new band ready to record and go on tour.
A similar ad soon ran in the Boston Phoenix. The ad was unlikely related to the act whose attention to by Bill had annoyed members of Kiss, Billy Idol. Aucoin had already known guitarist Steve Stevens, having managed his prior band, Fine Malibus. It was likely a result of this relationship that placement of Steve's song, First Day in the Rain, resulted on Peter Criss's Let Me Rock You album. The song was unsuited for the new album being recorded following Steve's recruitment for Billy's new group. Internally, Aucoin publicist Ida Langsam nailed what the band needed to do in a memo to the members on February the 25th.
It is imperative at this point to rebuild a strong rock image for Kiss. The band must once again begin to become associated with everything that rock stands for. In fact, we must reverse many of the publicity angles we went for in the past year in order to accomplish this. The campaign should peak at the same time the new album will be released. Therefore, we must begin by laying the groundwork now and building the campaign in levels. It is also important to present a united group front at this time, in order to stave off any further premature rumors about the situation with Ace. By focusing on a heavy rock profile of the group members individually as well as the band as a whole, we can take what is already quickly spreading hearsay and use it to our advantage. After all, it is very rock and roll for a key member of a famous rock group to disagree with the other members and want to pursue a solo course.
But in that very memo, a redacted word, premature, regarding the rumors about the situation with Ace, indicates that Ace was in reality very much done. The pre-production contract with Michael James Jackson was explicit, stating,
Producer will commence pre-production of the LP on February 15, 1982, and will continue to render such services on a non-exclusive basis until such time as company and producer shall mutually determine to commence recording the LP, pre-production period. During the pre-production period, producer and artist shall select and work on material, consider co-writers and generally prepare for the production of the LP.
The first 5 weeks of Michael's contract were the equivalent of an audition to determine if appropriate material was being generated and the collaboration working. He had been paid an advance of $10,000 for those 5 weeks, but there was a clause that meant that he could be terminated anytime during that initial period. The same might be considered the case for the use of some of the material on the Kiss Killers album. The band needed to placate Phonogram, who were deeply displeased by the decline in sales and the utter fiasco the previous year, and, having had a year to determine what a mess their Casablanca purchase really was. Other important factors also came into play. By the time Music from the Elder was released, Kiss had already breached the album delivery term of their minimum recording obligation, MRO, and affiliates were getting restless for new product. Australia had been one territory threatening to issue a contractually permitted local best-of album in 1981. They had sent Aucoin a letter in January 1981 ravenously suggesting such, even before the breach took place that June. The terms of the 1980 Phonogram contract were straightforward.
During the term, if any LP of the minimum recording obligation, MRO, shall not be delivered within 13 months following the delivery of the prior LP of the minimum recording obligation, company shall have the right to compile and release in the territory a Best of LP.
The Unmasked album had officially been delivered on May 16, 1980, starting the countdown clock running. The Australian Polygram affiliate initially backed off their 1981 threat, proposing,
"If the Kiss Studio LP is not delivered by September 1981, we have the right to release a Best of LP before December 31, 1981, or, if we do not release a Best of now, we may release it at any time during the term."
When Kiss shifted gears in July 1981, going all in with the Elder concept, they missed that deadline too. Those details and the pressure it placed the band under are key to explaining what happened next, not only in relation to 1981, but the knock-on effect that would resonate for the rest of the decade. By the time Music from the Elder had flopped, it was clear that it was going to be a challenge for them to meet the next MRO deadline, having missed 2 already, and having made the business decision to sue Phonogram. It literally was a case of biting the hand that feeds repeatedly. Providing newly recorded material for inclusion on a compilation at least showed a good faith attempt to start the recovery process commercially. It also allowed the group to test the waters with a new creative approach. As of March 2nd, Ace Frehley was still in the picture, at least as far as Aucoin management was concerned. AMI had been pitched a soundtrack song for Kiss to consider recording for The Pirate Movie, a vehicle starring Christy McNichol and Christopher Atkins in a takeoff of Gilbert and Sullivan's Pirates of Penzance. Polygram had obtained the soundtrack rights, with Bill suggesting that the label felt the song was right for Kiss to record. He didn't seem particularly enthused, ending the memo, "Please let me know if you are interested in doing this song for the movie, so I may let Polygram know if we shall record it or not." It's overly formal language, and it's not clear which song Polygram may have been interested in Kiss recording, but they might have confused Kiss's swashbuckling Elder costumes for pirate metal. The songs selected for Kiss Killers were not throwaways or second-rate compositions. With work having started prior to the contract with Jackson being signed, by early March the list of prospective songs was being narrowed down. Michael met with Gene on March the 10th, going through his and externally submitted songs for consideration. While the 4 new tracks ended up being all Paul songs, there wasn't a shortage of material considered from or for Gene. These included the ancient title Eat Your Heart Out, which with rewritten lyrics may have been a completely different song than the versions from 1977. Gene and Adam Mitchell had also clearly collaborated by that point, and their first effort, Chrome Goes Into Motion, gained traction once the session started. Adams, My Love Goes With You, and First Love were also considered, the former of which has often been noted as a co-write with one Vincent John Cusano. Gene was also taken by another Adams song, the first which he'd been played. It was titled Something Seems to Happen at Night, and he recorded a rudimentary vocal for it. Another new collaborator, Mickey Free, provided When the Legend Dies, Oh So Right, and Tempt the Fates. Mickey had been a guitarist in the group Smokehouse and had been noted by Gene as a future talent in August 1975 when his version of the band opened for Kiss. During 1980, as Mickey tried to establish himself as an artist, Gene had been noted as one of his industry supporters. A couple of songs may have been Simmons' compositions. Their titles seem to speak to that: She Made Me All I Am and Monster Lick. But their details are not recorded in Jackson's notes from the meeting. Michael also recommended some songs from his established writers: Play With Fire by James Newton Howard, Loose Change, and I Can't Go On, probably both by Warren Williams, but it could equally have been Wendy Waldman, who had songs placed on both of Michael's Jesse Colin Young and James House projects. A final song, Don't Call Me, has unclear attribution. Michael also listened back to leftovers from various other sessions, liking Gene's Sentimental Fool, which had been cut in instrumental form by Kiss during the first sessions with Bob Ezrin in Toronto during May 1981. It was transformed into Tell It to a Fool. While none of this material was used on either 1982 Kiss album, inclusions on the Super Deluxe edition from 2022 suggest there was a concerted effort made to develop the ideas to determine whether there was anything credible to build on. Paul Stanley's material was more straightforward. Nowhere to Run was fully fleshed out, also predating the Elder sessions. Bill Aucoin reconnected Paul with Michael Japp, a songwriter who had co-written 3 songs for his 1978 solo album. The two knocked out a basic idea for Down on Your Knees within a few hours at Paul's Los Angeles hotel. With Kiss jamming at SIR Studios at the time, Bryan Adams was also rehearsing there, so he gave the song a listen and offered some contributions, bringing it to completion. When the song was recorded, Japp also contributed some rhythm guitar. Having connected Paul with Adam Mitchell successfully, Michael had also reached out to Bryan Adams' manager, who he had known from the publishing side of the business. He was aware of Bryan as an emerging talent, someone who could bring a strong melodic sense to the songwriting. Bryan also had a strong co-writing partnership with Jim Balance, and the pair had already written 40 songs for many notable acts. From that perspective, they were a perfect partnership to bring into the picture at this time. In Kiss and Make Up, Gene recalled offering a contribution to one of Paul's songs.
Kiss moved to Los Angeles, where Jackson was based. Paul and Eric rented places, and I moved into Diana's Beverly Hills home. I was completely distracted by Hollywood and movies, and my songwriting as a consequence suffered greatly. The 4 new songs were all written by Paul and co-writers. One of Paul's songs needed a bridge, so I suggested a melody line he didn't care for. I saved the melody and would later reuse it as the centerpiece of a song called I Love It Loud.
By March the 15th, Michael was busy making final preparations for the sessions. He had a call with Eric Carr to determine the drum configuration Eric wanted to use. Eric requested 22 and 24-inch kicks with either a new Pearl or Speed King pedal, an 18 or 20-inch floor tom, 10, 12, 14, and 15-inch toms, a 16-inch, a pair of 20-inch crash cymbals, a 22-inch ride cymbal with deep bell, and a 20-inch pang cymbal, and of course, 14-inch hi-hats. Getting Eric's kit together may not have been as smooth as hoped, with an all-caps note to contact drum gear guru Shep Lonsdale noted on March the 20th. Shep is famed for building the kit used for the sonic glory captured on Creatures of the Night, but it's interesting to note that he also played a part in the first 1982 sessions. Final rehearsals started on March the 22nd, with formal pre-production recording following on March the 24th. March the 26th served as something of an informal break, with Michael joining band members and friends for a celebration of Diana Ross's 38th birthday at her Beverly Hills home, which was leased to Neil Bogart at the time. Paul was photographed with co-writer Adam Mitchell at the event. Final pre-production rehearsals took place on March the 27th, with formal recording starting on Monday, March the 29th. As basic tracks for Nowhere to Run and Tell It to a Fool were being captured in Studio C, a call was made to New York to reach Bob Kulick on March the 30th. He'd been busy having performed studio work on Diana Ross's Why Do Fools Fall in Love in 1981, and had started recording balances in for the Count during the early part of 1982. He'd had a demo of Sentimental Fool and had worked on lyrics for the new song with Adam Mitchell. Lyrics, as printed in the Creatures Super Deluxe, illustrate why the song may not have been pursued. Take 13 of Nowhere to Run and Take 4 of Tell It to a Fool were marked as masters and bounced to a separate reel for additional work the following day. The track sheet for Tell It to a Fool suggests that while a rough vocal was recorded for the song on March the 30th, the recording of that song had started on the first day of the sessions. Another bed track was laid down the following day, this time for Chrome Goes Into Motion. A drums and bass track presented on the same box set seems to illustrate that it was the most basic foundational stage captured at minimum. Additional edits were also recorded for Nowhere to Run and Down on Your Knees. While only the bridge was worked on for the latter, extensive work was done for the bridge, solo, and intro of Nowhere to Run. Whether it was Paul sketching out a solo idea or some other player is not known. It's not clear what work was done on April the 1st, but sessions were certainly scheduled. Following day, extensive work took place on I'm a Legend Tonight, and take 15 of that song was transferred to Composite Master for additional work. By this stage of the sessions, the bulk of the work had been done, and Michael was also working sessions with Pablo Cruz and rehearsal with James House. Evenings from 7 p.m. remained reserved for work on the KISS project through April the 9th. Final recordings and overdubs, engineered by Dave Whitman, were completed between April the 13th and 15th, and the completed songs were mastered during an 8-hour session with Brian Gardner at Alan Zentz the following day. While Kiss Killers wouldn't be released until June, and Michael returned to his focus finishing Jesse Cullen Young's album, he continued to be in contact and work with members of Kiss prior to the official start of what became the Creature Sessions. For the members of Kiss, there was other business at hand once the masters for Kiss Killers had been delivered to Phonogram. The album was only scheduled for release in international markets, a result of the two separate contracts, and according to C.K. Lent and Kiss and Sell,
overseas, Phonogram reacted quickly. By February 1982, they asked Kiss to record 4 new songs. Hard rock songs were specified, which could be packaged with another 8 old Kiss songs to make a compilation album. Kiss Killers would show the faithful that Kiss was still a hard rock band at heart, and music from the Elder was an aberration. But it wouldn't be released in the States. There were already several live albums and greatest hits collections on the market, and another version, even with a couple of new songs hastily recorded in LA, would make Kiss look like they were milking the back catalog for every nickel. Some of the earlier Kiss compilations on Casablanca were unreleased in foreign markets. Kiss Killers came together fast. It sold modestly in most countries.
Officially, Ace Frehley retired as a member of Kiss effective March 31, 1982, through a separation agreement. However, it would only be through an agreement dated July 1, 1983, that the business relationship was redefined, with the Kiss company becoming the owner of the Spaceman character and makeup design subject to certain usage limitations. It was no laughing matter on April the 1st when Kiss lost their Diodario string endorsement deal due to a perception of lewd content included in Gene and Paul's March 1982 Circus magazine interview. Aucoin, who was clearly marking the time until the termination date of his contract, remained involved enough to respond to the company personally, accepting their point of view and thanking them for their prior relationship. But for Kiss, the reality of the Ace Frehley issue remained, and on April the 20th, ads with the same wording from the March Village Voice with AMI seeking guitarists started running in Boston's equivalent paper, The Phoenix. Billboard magazine was already piecing things together, reporting in their April the 24th issue,
An Aucoin management ad in the Village Voice looking for a heavy metal guitarist, plus recent no-shows at the San Remo TV taping and the recent Flo and Eddie TV special, raises speculation that Ace Frehley may be leaving Kiss.
But to be fair to Ace, Eric had also been excluded from the Flo and Eddie pilot appearance filmed in January. It was also very much a local program restricted to Channel 2, though backers Metro Media were hoping to have it picked up. Neither of those band members participated in the United Cerebral Palsy Center telethon that had been filmed on January the 5th either. By that time, the axe had fallen on Bill, and his relationship was terminated at the end of the month. A notable departure before May 1982 was publicist Ida Langsom. AMI was immediately reduced, having no replacement for Kiss in terms of cash flow. While Aucoin had signed Billy Idol in 1981, that partnership had yet to bear fruit. Billy's debut album was a few months from release, and the Don't Stop EP, issued at the end of 1981, had only sold 50,000 copies. Anton Fig's Spider had become Shanghai and were on the cusp of signing with Chrysalis Records. But neither of those two acts had anywhere near the same popularity or even prospects as Kiss. But another prospect, Chicago's Kid Rocker, were embryonic at best. Ace had been involved in another automobile accident, this time with Anton Fig, driving into a stone wall on July the 5th, 1982. It would be the injuries purportedly sustained that were used as an excuse for him not touring with the group for their 10th anniversary tour. At the time, local newspapers reported 2 men refused medical treatment after suffering minor injuries in a one-car accident. And while Anton was reported as the driver in the press, they suggest that it was actually he driving after a day of fishing and drinking. Ace was killing himself, and his misery was compounded by the stress of remaining in Kiss. He felt he had 2 choices, maybe live, or certainly die. He recalled in No Regrets,
The injuries I sustained in that accident affected me for several months and contributed to my lack of enthusiasm over getting back into the studio with Kiss. Really though, I had no interest in remaining with the band. The breakup was not nearly as explosive as you might think. It happened over the course of several months, with numerous conversations and meetings involving me and the guys, as well as our management team. Paul actually came up to the house and we hung out and talked for a while. We went to a mall in Stamford, Connecticut, did some shopping, and tried to recapture some of our old friendship. I look back on that now and realize it was a generous gesture on his part. Paul tried very hard that day to talk me out of leaving, but there wasn't much he could do to change my mind.
By mid-June, news of Ace's departure was hitting the press. While not widespread, it still made publications such as the Los Angeles Times and rock magazines, though in many cases it was reduced to a single line item buried within the entertainment gossip or minor news columns. Ace wasn't completely invisible during the period either, having served as an usher at close friend Eddie Solin's wedding on May the 30th. Clearly, he also made the press again when he and Anton Fig were involved in that car accident, but he may have benefited from the misspelling of his surname. Ace recounted the event in No Regrets, suggesting that while they had suffered minor injuries and refused medical treatment, he needed care once the shock of the accident wore off. Anton was also cited by the police for failing to drive in the proper lane prior to hitting a rock wall. With Bill Aucoin gone, Gene and Paul relied on increased services from their business managers, Glickman Marks. From June the 3rd, advertisements for an American supergroup seeking lead guitarist started appearing in West Coast papers and trade magazines. The hunt was on in earnest as recording of the full-length album project progressed for a replacement, permanent or temporary, guitarist to take over from Ace. Unlike the earlier suspected Village Voice and Boston Phoenix ads, these were big and brash with a slight wording change. American supergroup looking for a heavy metal lead guitarist. Next major U.S. arena tour to begin this summer. Must be outstanding onstage performer, tall, 6-foot range, long hair, and must sing and write. Professionals only to respond. Please send tape, photo, and resume. Released in mid-June 1982, Kiss Killer served its purpose of getting the group's makeup guys back in the record store racks internationally. It placated the group's label in the short term and started the process of sonic rehabilitation following the commercial suicide of Music from the Elder. It illustrated the point that even though they were under massive pressure and critically injured, Kiss were not willing to simply capitulate. They were going to face their destiny and not run away from whatever may happen. While not an instantaneous remedy, the album sold well enough and charted reasonably in Norway, Germany, and Austria. While it only reached number 21 on the Australian charts, it still did well enough to earn a gold record in that country. Several markets also released supporting singles, with 3 of the 4 new songs gracing the A-side. For Kiss, once the master recordings had been handed over to the label, they moved on to the next step in their quest for a return to glory. Men det är en historia för en annan gång. Thank you for listening to this episode.
And I hope you've enjoyed this because it's been a thrill for us. It really has. We enjoyed this. If we were funny or not funny, we tried our best.